You step off the gangway onto American soil, September 1945, and your legs threaten to buckle. Not from exhaustion, but from terror. For 3 weeks across the Atlantic, the other women whispered the same warnings. The Americans will strip you, starve you, parade you through their streets like animals. You've heard the stories, absorbed the propaganda, felt it settle into your bones like frost. Now the moment has arrived. A young soldier approaches, his face unreadable, and through a translator says 3 words that make no sense. Close your eyes. Your heart hammers. This is it, the humiliation you were promised. But when your eyelids flutter open, you see something that will shatter everything you thought. You knew about enemies, about mercy, about the very architecture of human decency. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by these untold chapters of history, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It's incredible how many of you, from São Paulo to Seoul, from Manchester to Melbourne, come together to explore these hidden moments that textbooks forgot. What you're looking at isn't a punishment chamber. It's a processing station with clean floors, fluorescent lights, and rows of folded white towels. The air smells of disinfectant and something you haven't encountered in years. Lavender soap. Real soap. Behind a wooden table, an American nurse waits, not with contempt, but with clinical efficiency. This isn't the America you were taught to fear. This is something far more dangerous to everything you believe, a system that refuses to become the monster you expected. The date was September 12, 1945, barely a month after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast. Weeks after the photographs from Hiroshima seared themselves into the world's consciousness. The war in Europe had ended in May, leaving behind a continent of rubble, starvation, and 8 million displaced souls. Among them were 847 German women, auxiliaries and civilian employees of the Wehrmacht, now classified as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. They had been loaded onto the USAT Edmund B. Alexander in Le Havre, France, a converted troop transport that still bore the scars of its wartime service, rust blooming along the hull, the smell of diesel and fear soaked into the wood. The journey had been miserable. Cramped berths below deck, the constant roll of the Atlantic saltwater spray mixing with vomit and sweat. But worse than the physical discomfort was the dread. Every woman aboard had been shaped by Joseph Goebbels' ministry of public enlightenment and propaganda, which had spent 12 years painting Americans as brutal, race-obsessed savages who would exact terrible revenge on German captives. Newsreels had shown bombed-out German cities and blamed American barbarism. Radio broadcasts warned that capture meant torture, sexual violence, forced labor unto death. The women believed it, not because they were fools, but because fear is the most efficient teacher, and their world had been nothing but fear for years. When the ship finally nudged against Pier 52 in New York Harbor, the women pressed against the portholes and saw something incomprehensible. Manhattan's skyline rose untouched, glass and steel glinting in the autumn sun. No ruins, no burned-out husks of buildings, no gaunt figures picking through rubble. The disconnect was so profound that several women wondered aloud if they had sailed to the wrong country. Greta Hartman, 23 years old, a clerk who had typed requisition forms in a Wiesbaden supply depot, later wrote in her diary, "The war had devoured Germany, but here it had left no mark. I thought we had been fighting the same enemy." Now I wondered if we had been fighting at all. American military personnel lined the pier, MPs with white helmets and sidearms, Red Cross volunteers with clipboards, a handful of German-speaking officers borrowed from Army intelligence. The women descended the gangway in silence, each footfall echoing their internal collapse. No jeering crowds, no raised fists, just the efficient choreography of bureaucracy. They were herded, gently but firmly, into canvas-topped trucks that smelled of fresh paint and motor oil. As the convoy rolled through lower Manhattan, the prisoners stared through the gaps in the canvas at a world that defied comprehension. Bakeries with plate glass windows displayed rows of golden loaves. Butcher shops hung with cuts of meat they hadn't seen since 1942. Children in wool coats walked beside their mothers, faces round and healthy. Every block contradicted the narrative they had swallowed. In Germany, the daily civilian ration had plummeted to 860 calories by the war's end, less than half the minimum needed to sustain basic metabolic function. Here, grocery stores overflowed. The United States in 1945 was producing more than 200 million pounds of butter annually, while Germany's dairy industry had collapsed into a black market lottery where a pound of butter could cost a month's wages. The trucks turned north, leaving the commercial districts behind, and pulled into Fort Dix in New Jersey, then transferred the women to a processing camp near Camp Shanks in Orangeburg, New York. The facility was surrounded by chain-link fencing, topped with barbed wire, guard towers at each corner, floodlights mounted on steel poles. The women's terror returned in a wave. This was it. The deception was over. Now the cruelty would begin. But the cruelty never came. Instead, the scale of the operation became clear, and with it, the first hairline fractures in their certainty. The camp was immaculate. Gravel paths raked smooth. Barracks painted a crisp olive green. Latrines that genuinely functioned, with running water and sewage systems that didn't back up. The United States Army, even in its prisoner-of-war camps, maintained standards that exceeded the conditions in most German civilian housing. This wasn't an accident. It was policy, born from a combination of Geneva Convention obligations, American logistical abundance, and a calculated psychological strategy. Treat prisoners well, and you dismantle their ideology more efficiently than any interrogation. The camp administrator, a lieutenant colonel named Raymond Fisher, had served in North Africa and Italy. He had seen Axis POWs, Italian soldiers who wept with relief at their capture, German paratroopers who spat at their guards until hunger softened them. Fisher understood that humiliation bred resistance, while dignity bred doubt. So he designed his camp not as a punishment, but as a mirror. Let them see what they had been lied to about. Let them see what their leaders had withheld. The women were processed in groups of 20. Each was given a medical examination, checked for lice and communicable diseases, then directed to a low building with steam rising from roof vents. Greta's group hesitated at the entrance. In German camps, steam often meant delousing chambers, meant humiliation, meant standing naked in front of sneering guards. Several women began to pray under their breath, Lutheran hymns whispered like shields. But the door opened and the shock was immediate and total. The building housed individual shower stalls. Not communal troughs, not cold water hoses, but separate stalls with curtains for privacy. The floor was tiled and clean. The air smelled of lavender and lye. On a long wooden bench sat stacks of white towels, rough but clean, and beside them bars of soap wrapped in waxed paper. Real soap, not the gray wartime slurry that left your skin raw. An American sergeant, a middle-aged woman with a Brooklyn accent, gestured toward the stalls and spoke through a translator. "Take your time. Use as much hot water as you need. Your old clothes will be disinfected or replaced." No one moved. The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. Greta later wrote, "We expected monsters and found maids. One by one, the women approached the stalls. Greta turned the tap, and hot water surged out with startling pressure. She flinched, then let it cascade over her hands, her forearms, her face. The heat was almost painful after so long without it. In Germany's bombed-out cities, water systems had been shattered by Allied raids. Families boiled snow in winter, rationed gray water in summer. Here, in a prisoner camp, hot water flowed as if it cost nothing, because to America it didn't. Greta unwrapped the soap. It smelled like her grandmother's linen closet, like a world before uniforms and air raid sirens. She lathered her hair, scrubbed her scalp until it tingled, and felt tears mixing with the water. Around her she could hear the same thing, women weeping quietly, not from sadness, but from the sudden, unbearable kindness of being treated as human. The showers lasted 20 minutes. When they emerged, the women were handed clean cotton shifts and canvas slip-on shoes. Their old clothes, stinking of seawater and sweat, were taken away in canvas bags. No theft, no confiscation. Just hygiene. The paradox deepened. They could not look away from the fact that their captors, the enemy they had been taught to despise, cared more for their dignity than their own officers ever had. After drying off and dressing, the women were led across the compound to a mess hall. The building was long and low, with rows of tables and benches, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The smell hit them before they entered, a warm, rich aroma of cooked meat, butter, yeast. Several women stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed. Greta's stomach clenched so hard she thought she might vomit. Inside, American cooks in white aprons worked behind a serving line, ladling food onto metal trays with the bored efficiency of any cafeteria worker. There was no ceremony, no speech, no lecture, just food. Each woman received a tray. On it, a portion of mashed potatoes glistening with butter, a thick slice of meatloaf, still steaming, green beans cooked with onions, a roll of soft white bread, a square of pale yellow butter, a cup of black coffee, bitter and strong, and for dessert a slice of canned peach and syrup. Greta stared at the tray as if it were a hallucination. Her younger brother Fritz had died in February 1945, age 11, from pneumonia worsened by malnutrition. He had begged for bread in his final days, and she had nothing to give him. Now she held more food than her family had seen in a month, and the injustice of it, the impossible, cruel absurdity, made her hands shake. She sat down. Around her the other women did the same, silent, almost reverent. One woman whispered, "Mein Gott." Another crossed herself. Greta picked up her fork and cut into the meatloaf. The meat was dense, flavorful, salted properly. She chewed slowly, forcing herself to swallow. Her body wanted to devour it. Her mind wanted to reject it. She settled on something in between, eating mechanically, tears streaming down her face. The United States military in 1945 allocated approximately 3,200 to 4,000 calories per day to prisoners of war in stateside camps. In compliance with the Geneva Conventions and as a demonstration of American abundance. Meanwhile, civilian rations in occupied Germany hovered around 1,000 calories, often less in the ruined cities. The contrast was not accidental. It was a weapon sharper than any blade. As the women ate, American soldiers moved through the mess hall, refilling coffee cups, offering seconds. No one shouted. No one insulted them. The MPs at the door stood with hands clasped behind their backs, watching, but not menacing. The silence in the hall was broken only by the scrape of forks on metal and the occasional sob. After the meal, the women were assigned to barracks. Each building housed 40 women in iron-framed bunk beds with thin mattresses and wool blankets. The barracks were heated, a small coal stove in the center radiating warmth. There were electric lights, wooden footlockers, and a latrine attached to the building with functioning toilets and sinks. Greta climbed into her bunk and lay flat, staring at the ceiling. Her stomach was full for the first time in years. Her skin was clean, she was warm, and she was terrified because none of it made sense. That night, sleep came in fragments. Some women wept into their pillows. Others whispered prayers or spoke softly in the dark about the people they had left behind. Greta opened her diary and wrote by the dim glow of a single bulb. We are prisoners, but we are fed. We are the enemy, but we are safe. I do not understand this mercy, and I am afraid of what it means. Morning arrived with a bell at 06:00 hours. Not the harsh clang of a military alarm, but a steady, almost polite ring. The women rose, dressed in the work uniforms provided, gray cotton shirts and trousers, and assembled in the yard for roll call. An American lieutenant explained the camp routine through a translator. Work detail from 08:00 to 1600 hours with a lunch break, evening meal at 1700, lights out at 2100. The work was mandatory but paid. Each woman would earn 80 cents per day, deposited into a camp account that could be used at the canteen for small luxuries like soap, chocolate, writing paper. 80 cents. It was less than an American factory worker earned in an hour, but to women who had worked without wages under the Nazi labor system, it felt revolutionary. They could not look away from the fact that even as prisoners, they had economic agency. Most of the women were assigned to the laundry, a large building filled with industrial washing machines, drying racks, and pressing tables. The work was repetitive and hot, folding shirts, pressing trousers, sorting socks, but it was familiar. Many had done similar work at home, and the rhythm was almost comforting. Greta worked at a folding table beside a woman named Ilse, a nurse from Hamburg who had treated wounded soldiers in a field hospital. Ilse folded a shirt, smoothed the sleeves, and said quietly, "My hospital had no morphine by the end. We held men down while they screamed. Here they give us wages and chocolate." Greta nodded. The paradox was exhausting. During the lunch break, the women returned to the mess hall for sandwiches, soup, and fruit. Every meal was the same small shock. Food that tasted good, portions that filled you. No fighting, no theft. The camp canteen, a small building near the barracks, sold items at subsidized prices. Hershey bars, Wrigley's gum, notebooks, pencils, hand cream. Greta used her first wages to buy a notebook with a red cover and a pencil. She filled it with observations, questions, confessions. "Why do they feed us?" she wrote. Why do they speak to us without hatred? Is this strategy, or is this who they are? The weeks passed. The women fell into routine, and routine bred a strange, uncomfortable stability. They worked, they ate. They wrote letters home, which were censored but allowed. They attended evening lectures, some on American civics, others on camp rules. A chaplain visited once a week, a Lutheran minister who spoke German and offered communion to those who wanted it. The women did not know how to reconcile any of it. Then, in early December, the camp administration announced a mandatory film screening. The women gathered in a large assembly hall, wooden benches arranged in rows facing a white screen. The lights dimmed. A projector clattered to life. No one spoke. The first images appeared: barbed wire, emaciated figures, piles of bodies. The footage was from Allied liberations of concentration camps: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The camera lingered on skeletal faces, open mass graves, survivors who could barely stand. British soldiers bulldozing corpses into pits. American medics weeping as they carried children. The hall was silent except for the mechanical whir of the projector. Greta felt her throat close. She had known vaguely that camps existed. Everyone knew. But the propaganda had framed them as labor camps, as necessary measures against enemies of the state. This industrial scale of death shattered that lie. She watched a child, maybe 6 years old, stare at the camera with eyes that had seen too much. She watched women with shaved heads, ribs visible through skin, clutching each other. She watched the furnaces. Some of the German women began to sob. Others sat frozen, faces blank. Ilse, beside Greta, whispered, "Gott im Himmel," God in heaven, but heaven felt very far away. When the film ended, the lights came up slowly. An American officer stood at the front and said, through the translator, "You are not responsible for this, but you must know what was done in your name." The words hung in the air. Not blame, but witness. Not punishment, but education. The camp could have brutalized them. The Americans had seen the camps. They had buried the dead. They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they chose this: hot showers, full meals, and the unbearable weight of truth. Greta wrote that night, "They have shown me what mercy looks like, and it is not forgiveness. It is the choice to treat the enemy as human, even when they do not deserve it. Even when we did not deserve it." The prisoners' collapse was quiet, but complete. Each kindness shattered the lies they had lived inside. Nazi doctrine promised superiority and taught cruelty as strength, yet Americans showed a power, mercy. At night, the women whispered about propaganda, hatred, and betrayal by their own leaders. They learned the Reich had starved and deceived them, while the enemy fed them and asked only truth. In February 1946, repatriation was announced. Germany was ruins, yet the camp felt like sanctuary. Greta returned to Wiesbaden to a gaunt mother and a broken nation, carrying guilt for surviving in comfort. Neighbors doubted her stories, but she had seen the films and the bodies. Years later, as a teacher and grandmother, Greta shared one lesson: mercy is not weakness. It is choosing the human beyond the uniform, the future beyond the past. It changes people, endures longer than bombs, and remains the only victory that lasts.